Continuing our series on the resurrection and its historicity. Okay. So, one of the strongest points is that the resurrection message itself was very, very early. It wasn't decades later as some, myth or legend have crept in. Scholars say it takes multiple generations. They're naming around 4 generations for legend or myth to take over a story. They don't appear immediately while these eyewitnesses are still alive. They haven't died off. They're still alive. They're still there. Can be like, wait a minute, that's not how it went down, right? So they can correct any false claims that are made. One of the earliest and clearest message we have of this is in First Corinthians chapter 15. Paul, he reminds the Corinthian church, right? He reminds them of a creed that he had passed on to them even earlier than the writing of this. And he says in that creed that Christ died for our sins, he was buried, he was raised on the third day, and that he appeared to many people. Scholars across the spectrum agree that he's quoting a very early creed here. One that he didn't create himself, he received it from others and passed it on to the Corinthian church. What makes this super powerful and important is the dating. Paul wrote First Corinthians somewhere around 20 years after the crucifixion. In itself, that's early, but the creed goes back much earlier, and most scholars date it within 2 to 5 years after the crucifixion. That's extremely early by ancient standards. So this means that the resurrection, it wasn't a late theological development. It was there from the beginning. And even more impressive is in the creed, he names the eyewitnesses, right? Many of them. He says Peter, the 12 apostles, James, the brother of Christ, and then a group of 500 people that, saw the risen Jesus. Many of which he says that are still living. And this is kind of a challenge saying, hey, if you don't believe me, go check it out. So this is not how legends are told. They're not saying, yeah, all this incredible legendary stuff and people are still living. Go check it out. That's not how it works. If this wasn't true, these people would have been like, well, that's not the way it went down. They had nothing to gain from this other than, we've talked about recently, persecution and and torture. So when historians look at the resurrection, they're not starting with stories long after the fact. They're starting with early creeds, early eyewitness claims, and a message that was proclaimed immediately in the very place where Jesus was killed, where there were a lot of hostile enemies and people that could have said this is not true. So the early testimony forces historians to ask a very important question. What happened, right? What happened that caused so many people so early to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, right? Obviously, we believe that all signs are pointing to that Jesus actually rose from the dead. But we're going to dive in more in the next devotion. Stay tuned. Hope you're getting a lot of value from this, and God bless.